Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And we are -1 podcaster this week. Courtney is under the weather and we miss Courtney. But, that said, I'm very proud of Rye. Rye shared on the podcast a few weeks ago a story about the anxiety that she feels before we do podcast episodes and performances and PD in general sometimes. And with Courtney not being here and it just being us, I was just talking to Rye about whether we wanted to still go. And she shared this awesome quote with me, grow through what you go through. I'm going to say that again because it's tough to say. Grow through what you go through. It's easier to read than to hear. But just such an awesome thought, and so proud of you, Rye, for being brave.
I'm happy to be here, even though I may not sound like it. I really am happy to be here, and I'm glad we're still going forward.
Yeah, it's a nice way to end the week. But just to recap, we've been on a self-care series for 7 episodes, 7 weeks, almost 2 months. And our boss, Jamie, asked us how long we were going to go on our self-care series. And I was saying, I don't know, whenever we run out of things to talk about. But that said, we are going to take a pause. We're going to come back to self-care, but we're going to take a pause and talk about student engagement this week. And that basically, Rye, I think it's your life as well. Just everything right now is either self-care or student engagement. And I'm not complaining, for the record.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah, those are the two big deals right now that are my whole world professionally. So we're going to shift to the other one temporarily, student engagement. And we, in this episode, are going to share an easy-to-remember formula, 3 things to keep in mind when you're making choices as an educator and as an instructor. And when you're wondering, why are my students disengaged? Or how can I get them to engage more? The questions of the day. These are 3 things that can help you remember and, like a compass, point me in the right direction of some tweaks that I can make to move the needle.
But before we get too far ahead, Nick, let's talk about what's filling our buckets this week.
Let's.
So I can go first. Last night turned into a last-minute impromptu date night with my husband, Nate, when I suggested that I wanted to maybe get ahead of the shopping crowds this weekend at Riverdale, and said that I wanted to do some Christmas shopping, and he invited himself along. He said, get a babysitter and let's go together. So maybe I manifested it from our last conversation in the podcast, but he joined it and he actually enjoyed it. So
yeah, we were just in our holiday self-care episode last week talking about stress-proofing your relationship and about sharing the holiday tasks such as shopping. So we don't know whether Rye's husband listened to the podcast episode and got some ideas, but that's awesome.
Maybe he secretly did. I will never know.
You'll never know. What's filling my bucket is working with people who I am comfortable with and have the psychological safety with to be vulnerable and straightforward. I like to use this phrase. I call it my old man phrase, let's just talk brass tacks. I just feel like that's my key phrase that I throw out in conversations these days. And I just love that there's people that I work with where I don't have to worry about constantly managing my impression and wondering through the whole conversation, are they going to think I'm stupid if I acknowledge a mistake that I made? Or are they going to judge me if I, start talking about a problem that frustrates me? And are they going to think is Nick just admiring the problem? There are people who give me the grace and have the trust and relationship with to just try and focus solely on the problems and not worry so much about that impression management. And I think that vulnerability, if you listen to Brene Brown or read Brene Brown, she obviously talks about that. And it's so refreshing to have those relationships in your working life.
It is. We do have a great team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just something I'm grateful for all the time, but especially in a really difficult year. So we're going to shift to our main topic, student engagement. And I don't think we have to establish why we're talking about this. It's obviously a concern with distance learning. We need kids to show up. That's step 1. log on, and then we need them to participate, go with the flow, in some cases turn on cameras and learn. Like that, at the end of the day, it's the learning that we want. So student engagement is essential to making that learning happen. But let's step back for a moment. What do we know for sure about our relationship as educators with student engagement? And I'm going to propose a couple of things. Number one, we can't control student engagement. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago when Nicole Woodward was here. We can't directly control it. So I can't drive to 30 kids' houses and make them all stare at the screen and make them all click the mouse where they need to go. Like that direct level of control, I just don't have. That said, we can influence it. And there's a lot that we can do to change the instruction, the environment, the curriculum, the prompting. Everything around the kiddo changes. We don't change anything about that kiddo, but we can set things up where they're a lot more likely to want to log in and want to participate and want to go with the flow. Boom, engagement goes up. Number 3, this one I think about all the time. I think, and I was talking to a couple educators from other districts earlier this week, it's a heck of a lot easier to think about changing your whole group practices and routines versus worrying about trying to solve these problems student by student. We have a finite amount of energy, and if we begin our problem-solving process by thinking about every student individually, like Johnny's not engaged, let's think about how can we change things for Johnny, and then Betsy's engaged, and how can we change things for Betsy? I'm having a hard time not just using the names of the characters from the Taylor Swift album, right? Because we've both been listening to the new Taylor Swift album.
Waiting for Dorothea.
Dorothea, Marjorie.
Marjorie.
If I begin and try and tackle these problems student by student, it's going to be exhausting compared to beginning with what can I change for our whole group routines and the way we do discussion as a whole group, the way I've designed the lesson for the whole group, the prompting practices that I use with the whole group. Like beginning with that saves me a lot of energy. And that's not to say that we never need to individualize. Obviously not. Rye currently works in special education for most of her day. I have worked in special education at a Setting 4 program, which is like the special education of the special education separate building, for a number of years. So we're obviously no strangers to like individualizing what we're doing for kids. But that said, I don't know, Rye, if you've had this experience, when we're writing these individualized plans, often we're dealing with similar issues, and a big percentage of the strategies and the things that we're thinking are good for this individual student are going to be good for the next student we're writing an individualized plan about. And there is, I think, something to be said for, hey, if I just adopt this good thing that I should be doing, like a pre-corrective prompt, like preventative prompting during a transition, for example, just educator speak here. If I just adopt that as my go-to for everyone, I save myself so much headspace and energy that I'm trying to use up if I'm trying to solve these problems and change what I'm doing kid by kid, one at a time.
Yeah, I help case managers with a lot of behavior support plan writing, and it's funny, all the commonalities that you can pull from all the behavior support plans across districts, even though that's an individualized plan, a lot of those strategies are similar and the same. So.
Yeah, right, because a lot of this stuff just works really well, and it's good to just, build into our whole group routines. And I went to a networking session earlier this week with Courtney, and Courtney went to a training session at a conference last week, all this about student engagement. And I just wanted to say everyone has their framework and a way that they explain how to engage kids, or we just get kind of like a random list of tips. You may have been at a PD session in years past where, we just kind of go slide to slide and it's kind of an assortment of tips. And Rye knows me. I'm just like crazy about organization. And
No.
It just kind of drives me nuts. No, not at all. It just drives me nuts how, most of these strategies, even in all these PD presentations and books and articles, are generally the same, and they get arranged different ways. And let's not get too into the arrangement of things. That said, I will ask you, we're going to share our formula in a couple of minutes of student engagement, and it's 3 factors and 3 things to remember. And I'll just say, I found that to be incredibly useful when I've been in a position as an instructor, because it's 3 things that I can remember very easily and think about how I can build practices into the lesson routine to keep kids engaged and to foster engagement. So just speaking to that piece, what you're going to hear from us, you might think like, oh God, it's another like framework of things to remember and it's just the same strategies. Yeah, and like I've been in those shoes too. But I think if you hear us out, you will appreciate how it can help you just approach your decision making as an instructor.
So Nick, let's talk about ways we can approach engagement from a whole group lens first.
Yeah, and we're going to come at it from the perspective of motivation. And you may have heard of these phrases, extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Rai, can you lay out extrinsic motivation for us?
Sure. Extrinsic motivation is the work that has little or no immediate meaning to students, but there are external outcomes that keep them engaged. So this could be like gaining rewards, like getting good grades or earning an allowance, or it could be avoiding negative consequences, like not getting in trouble with their parents for missing work, for instance.
And extrinsic motivation gets, I hesitate to use this word because it sounds really severe, but demonized. I'm just struggling with word retrieval. But a lot of educators, it becomes really black and white between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And I think there's more gray area to that. It's not like one is the best in the world and the other we should never deal with at all. I mean, like an example of extrinsic motivation is a paycheck. Like I love my job. I would not go to my job without that extrinsic motivation. So like there's a place for it. And without diving deep into this topic, I'll just say like it is important. It has a role, but we shouldn't rely on it 100% of the time. Extrinsic motivation. One thing about it is that just on its own, it tends to work short term and produce the minimal amount of engagement. So we only go up to that bar where we get that reward, and that's generally where we stop and where we're motivated to stop. And the short term part is, it's difficult to keep something extrinsic, external that's going to keep that kid engaged for a really long period of time. Because if we just say rely on good grades, and it's like, well, eventually the rubber meets the road and the kid might be like, well, grades aren't doing it anymore. So it's going to work short term and only produce minimal amount of engagement.
Yeah, that appeal kind of starts to wear off.
Yeah.
So the next one is intrinsic motivation, or the inner fire. And this is also the more sustainable or long-term option. So often kids surprise us with how engaged they are when they do go above and beyond.
Yeah, and that inner fire, we do have a short 2.5-minute video on our SEL website, and it's going to get linked into the show notes that goes through kind of what Ryan and I are talking about in this episode, but just in 2.5 minutes, very boiled down. But anyway, inner fire, the graphic that I chose for the video ride does look like someone with heartburn because it's like that inner fire. So if you turn the audio off, you might think you're watching a heartburn commercial. But yeah, kids, when
hopefully that's appealing for people to go check that out.
Yeah, just that right there is enough of a draw. When we do light that inner fire, and easier said than done, guys, right? You might be listening and thinking that. When we do light that inner fire, yeah, kids will surprise us with how engaged they will be. It's almost like flipping a switch sometimes, like, oh, this kid suddenly is intrinsically motivated and look at what they can do.
Yeah, I think as a teacher, that is our very favorite thing about why we go into teaching. As soon as that ignite starts, we're like, yes, we did it, we're doing something, we're changing lives, and that passion really just comes through.
Yeah, it's like that light, it's almost literally like an inner fire, because that light you can see in the kids' eyes, and it's like you have something that they get to class and they hear what they're doing and they look at you with that look, and it's just like, wow, this is such a different experience than I've had when we felt like we were just kind of grinding along for the last couple days or longer than that. It's just so refreshing when that happens.
Exactly.
So we are going to talk about our 3 3-part formula, 3 things to remember when we're talking about how do we ignite that inner fire? How do we get kids intrinsically motivated so that they show up and then participate? But
before we dive in, Nick, we do have one disclaimer. So we just want you all to know that you're teaching in a pandemic. You didn't sign up for this. You're amazing. You're a good teacher. I'm going to repeat that, Nick. You are a good teacher. So we're going to explain some strategies, and it might sound like we think it's easy, but we know it's not. So this is hard work, and we just want to remind you to take it one step at a time.
Thank you, Rye. I think that's a really important thing to remember, because whenever you're in a professional learning session or listening to a podcast like this, and it just sounds like it's like, oh, they think it's so easy, and that can really hurt. It can be like toxic positivity. So we just want to put that out there. Let's just take it one step at a time and give ourselves grace.
You're
We're just
doing
trying to move the needle a little bit at the time. I really like that reminder. Like, you were teaching in the middle of a global pandemic. You are a good teacher.
Yeah. And like we mentioned earlier too, like you're growing through what you're going through. So kudos.
Oh, way to bring it back, Rye. Way to bring it back. So before we get into our 3-part formula, just wanted to say we didn't come up with this out of thin air. It's based on something called self-determination theory. You can Google that and dive into that if you would like to. It's a little bit fancy, has some fancy vocab that is not necessarily easy to get into your brain and help you remember and guide yourself day to day. So basically what we did is take that theory and rebrand it into a formula that I think is personally a little bit easier to remember. And I did, when we were working on this formula a couple of years ago, run it by a couple students I was working with at the time, high school students, and they gave me the thumbs up. They said it made sense. They said that like they wished their educational experience had reflected these things. They didn't use those exact words like, Mr. Vanos, I wish my educational experience had reflected these 3 principles. No, but they did give approval for it. So we took that theory and we turned it into this formula. So A, how much do I belong here? Think of that on like a scale from 0 to 100 if it helps you. Just think about that kid. How much do they belong here? They feel safe and supported in their learning environment. Multiply that by B, how much do I care about this? So how much choice do I have and say in what I'm doing? How much does it align with my personal goals and my preferences? Multiply that by C, the 3rd part, how likely am I to feel successful? And that doesn't mean that I'm like getting a gold star or a sticker and like the best student in the world. It means that I feel like I'm being successful, like I'm learning, like I'm doing a good job. And you put all that together, and if you actually did a formula with this, you could, calculate something for each of those. That's not the point. I mean, we lay it out as a formula just to indicate all 3 of those things. How much do I belong here? How much do I care about this? And how likely am I to feel successful? All 3 of those are important. And if we drop the ball totally in one of those areas, it's going to sink the whole thing, basically. So you could have a kid, and maybe you've had a student like this, where they care about the content. Maybe you're a history teacher, and this kid really cares about the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, and they feel like they're going to be successful. Say that you're doing a writing activity, and this kid is a good writer. So they care about the content. They feel like they're going to be successful with the way that you're assessing their learning, but they don't feel like they belong. They feel threatened by multiple of their peers. They just don't feel accepted in the classroom. They don't feel known or seen. It could sink their engagement totally. They could just like sink down into their desk because that one piece is missing, and it's a really important piece. So let's break this down. We're going to dive into some strategies that we can use for each of those areas. So help them belong is number 1. And Rye, I think this is a very important one. Big focus right now. We are getting all kinds of communication about we need to help these kids be connected. We need to maintain relationships with them. And one thing to remember is like this is possible. One thing we were talking about is kids have established very strong relationships, just for example, with mobile gaming networks. So video games, if you don't know, are really different from when Ryan and I were kids. When Ryan and I were kids, you had to invite people over and all sit in the living room to play video games together. And that's not how it is anymore. You don't save video games like you do. It's not like you finish levels. It's just people are always playing with people tens of or hundreds of thousands of miles away, and they just log on together.
You're not trying to get to the castle in Super Mario anymore.
And there are kids who are deeply connected to people that they have never seen or very rarely see through these mobile networks. So it's just one example people have brought up of like, yeah, it's possible to maintain these connections and form relationships even though we're not physically in the same space. And when we think about that idea of belonging, let's expand that word a little bit more. I think of safety is one, and not just physical safety. We're talking about like psychological safety. Like, am I going to get picked on or disrespected? Being known, like you want to be working with people who know things about you and don't just talk to you like you're like a robot or something. Like they know about what you care about. They know about your family. Like they just know things about you. And respected. So people are just generally kind and polite to you. So like a kid, the kind of thoughts that I want them to have circling through their head are like, well, they care if I show up or not. Like they're going to miss me if I'm not here. They know who I am. The classroom I'm signing on to is somewhat predictable. Like I know if this happens, like if someone says something nasty to me, I know this is how my teacher is going to handle it. That kind of predictability. So we are going to jump into a couple ideas of strategies that you could, again, one step at a time, bite size, use to enhance distance learning and engagement to help kids feel like they belong more. We are only going to do a little superficial glance over these things, and listening to us just glance over them probably isn't enough for you to feel confident and like, oh, I got everything I need. I'm good to go. I'm going to implement this tomorrow. So we are going to link into the show notes a page on our SEL website where we have tools for some of these things, because you don't have to start from scratch. Like we're all sharing resources right now, like pick up and use tools. And then we're aiming for like short little bite-sized videos, like 2 to 3 minutes that explain each of these things. And like usually show you the tool while we're explaining it. So one is just shared expectations. So we may, before the pandemic, have classroom rules posted in our classroom. They might be the classroom expectations if we're a PBIS school. You know, I've got the same classroom expectations that every teacher in the building does. Generally, like there was probably something there to establish what your shared behavior expectations were before the pandemic. Having worked with a lot of buildings and classrooms since the pandemic, this has just looked really different depending on each building and each teacher, Rye. I don't know if that's been your experience too. Some people, somewhere last spring or early this fall, they were a PBIS school and they preset remote learning expectations. So say that as a school, they're safe, respectful, responsible. Those are our 3 things that we do. And they set up, like in our remote learning, what is safe going to look like, what's respectful, what's responsible going to look like. And every teacher has that, and it's kind of preset. So that's one thing people have done. Another thing people have done is they take those 3 to 5 things. So like we're safe, we're respectful, we're responsible. And each teacher met with their class or classes and asked like, what does safe look for us, guys? Give me some ideas. And they like get student input, and then they kind of formulate their own class specific way of doing those PBIS expectations. And you know, that's fine. It's anytime you get student input, that's great. You're going to get some investment then. The only issue is then kids possibly having multiple sets of slightly different varying expectations that they are responsible for meeting. Other teachers have collected student input, so just open question, no PBIS framing, just kind of, all right, guys, what do you think we should be holding to? What should our responsibilities be for behavior while we're learning remotely, for our chat, for our microphones? And they just open it up, and then they formulate expectations. And some have just come to their class with a preset set of expectations. So like I, as the teacher, came up with this, and I'm just kind of telling you what these expectations are going to be for our specific classroom. So there's just a lot of different ways we can handle this. They all have pros and cons. It's, I think, important, and Rye, I think you would agree, that something is set up and we're routinely communicating and reminding kids, like at the beginning of class, like about some set of expectations, because it creates that like predictability for kids.
Yeah, it's just like those norms that we set up at our meetings. Like everyone's on the same page, everyone can expect the same thing, everyone's going to have the same response. It just makes the management so much easier.
And I've been talking to people about cohorts of students who are anxious, and they're having difficulty logging in because they're anxious about logging in. And this is just one way we can change the environment so that it's nothing is a silver bullet, but this is going to help in a lot of cases. Like, just there's a little bit more predictability. I know that the whole class is going to hear these reminders at the beginning of class when I log in about what we're supposed to be doing. I know that it's going to be clear when someone steps out of those bounds, and then hopefully, you know, the teacher can handle that. So as a student, it'll be a little bit less intimidating if this stuff is set up. Another example of how we can help kids belong is getting to know them. And one of the easiest ways to do this is doing some kind of a student interest survey. And we have a really good example as a Google form survey that you could copy off the website that we're going to link into the show notes. And you would do it like at the beginning of a new grading term, basically when you've got a new group of students, and it asks questions about, you know, their hobbies, those general like get to know you stuff. And it also asks like what their favorite way of, like their favorite stuff to do in class. Like, do you like whole group instruction more? Do you like the small group stuff more? And that can inform so many decisions you make as an instructor of how you set stuff up so that you know your kids are more likely to like it and be engaged with it.
Yeah, I always even enjoy filling out those interest surveys. As a teacher, it was one of my favorite parts of information to receive from families and students, just because I like building relationships, and those were things that I could really start at and hone in on. My experience comes from an elementary lens again, so there's some differentiation that you can do outside of a Google form. Activities like the brown paper bag. So, you know, students fill up a bag of all the things that they like around their house, and then they get to share what that is. Or my daughter did a plate activity. It was designed around Thanksgiving, so I think that had something to do with it. But she filled up a paper plate of pictures and words and things that she liked to do and things that described her. So then they all went around and sharing their plates and their interests. So it not only allows students you to learn about your students, but the other students to learn about their peers.
Yeah, and that kind of like when you get into activities, then it leads into games, and games are another way. I've seen a lot of teachers doing some really great games to help get to know each other, and that really helps with relationship building. I know one I saw on TikTok the other day was a teacher who had a PowerPoint, and it was like, tell me who you are without telling me. So people were just giving little bits of like factoids about themselves, and then everybody was guessing which student it was, basically. Icebreaker questions are another, and I really love if people listen to the podcast and then jump onto the website, because we do have a really good like document of example icebreaker questions, and then a short little video that explains, like, if you have the chat enabled on Google Meet or Zoom or whatever, it's really easy to do these icebreaker questions in the chat, and it actually goes a lot faster mobily than how it would in a classroom. It's just one of the advantages actually of distance learning in this case, because you can have kids type in. But just having that as a routine, like every day or once a week, or like on Mondays and Tuesdays, on Mondays and Wednesdays maybe, we start class with an icebreaker, just building in that relationship building stuff.
We like, at our house, we like would you rather questions. So we have a book even when we're driving down the road, like, would you rather eat pickles for the rest of your life or M&Ms? Something like that.
Yeah, I love
and then
doing
they
those
describe
with students. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just get such interesting perspectives on how they make decisions.
Yes.
Leaving audio feedback on student work is one that I've connected with a couple teachers on and have gotten some excitement. I didn't get this idea myself. I got it from a teacher, and the videos that are on our website are just short little ones that he put together of how to leave audio feedback on student work with a bunch of different learning platforms and different sets of tools. Because I'd say generally, a lot of the issue with some of these strategies is just some people are using Zoom, some people are using Google Meet, some people, their district bought this extension or this website or this program. So everybody's got a different set of tools. And a lot of the work is just like getting over that hump of how do I do this with my tools that I have available to me? So thankfully that teacher did all the legwork for us. But research shows that kids are going to be 3 times more likely to implement our feedback on their work if it's with our voices, audio recordings, versus just reading what we wrote. Because there's so much nuance in your voice that is missing when it's just written down. I mean, those of us who've gotten emails in the pandemic know how much harder it is to know kind of what the person means than just hearing their voice. So really nice strategy where you're building relationships with the kid, letting them hear your voice while you're doing a natural thing you do, which is leaving feedback on their work. Lastly, we just wanted to mention like a temperature check. I think in a lot of adult meetings we're in, we're finding ways to do this. And a lot of people are doing this. I think just like, how are we doing? Because I can't read the room the way I normally would when we're in the room. So like giving people a way to put a GIF or like pick. Some of them are like animals, and it's like, I think, was it a koala or a sloth? It was a sloth.
Sloths. That was my favorite.
Was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and like different sloths with different facial expressions, and you say which one is the one that reflects how you're feeling right now. So there's a ton of different ways to do this. We have some examples on the SEL website, but making that a routine is a really nice way to show your kids that you care about how they're doing. And for you to just know, like if I'm reading the room and the room is very energetic right now, for example, we might want to do one of those brain breaks and get up out of our seats and do like some wiggles, for example, if we're an elementary school teacher. All right, that was just number 1, A, help them belong. Like we said, we're going to spend a lot of time on that one because it's really important right now. Everyone is trying to make sure that our classrooms feel connected. Number 2, part of our like 3-step formula, help them care about the content. And when you break that down, a big part of it is choice and autonomy. So kids having some voice and choice in any way you can build that in. And there's just so many ways. Like in normal times, seating chart is just one example. Like that's a place to build in choice. One teacher asked her class, she asked them, how long do you think you're going to need to complete this homework assignment that I just passed out in class? And she had in her mind a certain set amount of time. And I think it was 20 minutes as an example. And her students would say, well, I think we need 25. And she's like, oh, I don't know if I can give you 25. Could you do 20? And they were like, yeah, we can do 20. And it's just like, she got exactly what she wanted, but she like gave choices. So there's just so many different ways you can build in that choice, but we know we're more invested when we have some say in the process. So huge way to get kids to care.
Yeah, like one of the things that you talked about with choice, like you can provide choices on, the types of assignments, like what do kids want to write about? Provide them some writing prompts and they can choose which one. Or one thing I noticed or I saw recently for some different distance learning type strategies for Google Classrooms or Google Meets while you're running those with your students is you can give them different breakout rooms for what kind of support do they want. So there's 3 doors or 3 separate breakout rooms that they can decide to join. One is independent work where they're just in a room with all the rest of their peers that you jump in and out of to kind of monitor. One is a room with, you just have a question. So maybe there's another person in the room that can help answer and direct questions, or 3 is some just one-on-one teacher help. So however you choose to navigate that, but they can choose which room to be in and what support, and it will let you know what support to give them.
Yeah, so many examples of choice. We got to move on because we could just go on and on with just the different examples. Another way to help kids care about the content is helping them see the connection between the content and their interests or their goals. So it really helps if we know what their interests are. So, coming back to that thing we talked about with the surveys or different ways of just getting to know your kids and what they're interested in, the quicker we collect that information, the quicker we can start to build it in. I know this makes me feel old, when you see these like mobile game trends that it's obviously extremely popular and you feel like you're getting to the party really late, Rye. One of those is Among Us. That, like, I saw like teachers dressing up as those Among Us gaming characters and like dancing around their hallways around Halloween. And this is where I know I'm like really late to this party because I'm just starting to realize that it's a game.
It's funny that you mentioned that because during this podcast, my daughter texted me and she said, I missed my meeting with my teacher yesterday and we were going to play Among Us. And it was like the 3 sad emojis, like literally during this podcast. It's funny.
That is funny. So I guess I picked a good example. So making connections between the curriculum content and what kids are interested in. I know a lot of my students a year or two ago were extremely interested in Pokemon. So any connection I could make between the curriculum and Pokemon, I would jump at it. Another is just establishing rationale for the content. So I can share mine as a teacher. I can share some connection, like, I learned about this in school just like you guys, and here's how it influenced my life. What is even more impactful is leading students in a reflection of like, what do you hope to get out of this? And they might say like, I'm not going to use this math in 20 years. I'm going to do this job, X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to have to know math. But like, okay, we are going to go through this for the next couple weeks. Like, this unit we're going to go about. You're going to be here. Like, what do you hope to get out of it? I always did this at the beginning of social skills classes that I taught because I'd have reasons that kids were in those classes getting that instruction around social emotional things, and their teachers and their parents could obviously raise their hands and say, well, this is what the student needs to work on. But when I did, and I didn't do it 100% of the time because I'm not perfect, and let's just remind that grace thing, like I didn't do this 100% of the time. But I did try and build in like a reflection activity or having kids fill out a survey at the beginning of like, what do you think you need to work on? What are you hoping you get out of this? Because I just want to know that and be able to reference it at the very least. Like, this is your goal and this is why you're here. This is what you're hoping to get out of this. And part C, the third part of our 3-part formula. So we've done, help them belong, help them care about the content, and lastly, help them feel successful.
So one thing that we can do to help them feel successful is praise effort and not intelligence or their talent. So one thing that I remember, I think we talked about it in one of those videos that you were describing earlier, Nick, one of those little bite-sized videos. But I used an example of praising my 4-year-old for staying in between the lines. And instead of saying, wow, Jade, you're such a good artist, I said, wow, you were really focused on coloring and you stayed between the lines. You worked so hard. And she just, when I say those types of things versus, oh, you're just such a good artist, she just carries herself higher and she's prouder, and it just has a bigger bang for my buck when I'm giving her compliments.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, this is tied to growth mindset. And growth mindset, one of the ways that it helps kids is they don't get so focused on preserving that impression of I'm smart or I'm talented, because those are things that we tend to think of as pretty fixed. Like you're this intelligent and that's what you're going to hold through your life. You were born with this talent for piano playing and like you just got it. And when kids build up that impression that like, oh, I'm really good at math, if they get a math question wrong, that can shatter that impression. So they become really worried about not making a mistake more than learning and taking risks, right? So they can always control the amount of effort they're putting forth. So we put the focus there and get them less worried about managing that impression. And kids almost get imposter syndrome. I mean, we get that as adults, like, oh my gosh, they're all going to find out that I'm not really a genius. So like, it's building that in from an early age, helping them feel successful. And, we want them to still feel successful even when they make a mistake. So praising effort is part of that. Another thing we can do here is multiple modes of assessment. And Courtney, if she were here, could tell an example when she was a teacher of when she made, I still can't believe this, 16 different ways that student could show their learning on one project that she did. I haven't gone that far.
That was impressive.
Yeah, it was impressive. I generally stick to 2 or maybe 3 ways that students could show their learning. Like I know I've done a presentation, Google Slides, a poster, or a story before is a common triad for me. But basically, if a kid doesn't feel secure in giving speeches, for example, just going to pick that one out of the hat. And if I'm an instructor and my whole class, let's pretend it's not a speech class, because speech classes, obviously, you're going to give a lot of speeches. But say that we're a history teacher and we really love speeches, and we've decided that we are going to assess learning every unit with a group speech. That student won't feel as successful as if we rotate and give them other opportunities and other ways to show what they learned. So it's another example by giving multiple modes of assessment, ways we can help kids feel successful. And one example of this that we have on the page we're going to link into the show notes is just having engaging discussion opportunities. Hexagon discussions, I don't know if you're listening, if you've heard of those before, but it's really cool. You take a set of terms like science terms or history terms, and you put them on literal hexagons on like a Google slide, and you let the kids arrange those in a small group to show up to 6 connections between one term or concept and another. And it's really cool because you never get the same arrangement from group to group, because kids are going to see different connections. Kind of like when we talked about Would You Rather games with kids, you just get really interesting different perspectives. And it's a really deep way of processing information that is very visual and easy to do virtually, because kids can be logged on in their breakout room, just arranging these hexagons and just having a discussion together. And it's going to be more engaging because they're literally moving things around than if they're just talking to each other. So really light breeze through of help them feel successful. So it's been a long episode. Let's tie it together and talk takeaways. Again, things that we know for sure. We can't control student engagement. We can't physically make the kids log in and show up and participate. We can influence it. We can change the things around the kiddo to make it a lot more likely that they're going to want to show up and participate. And if we focus on what we can't control, we're going to feel helpless. And that's, the track to burnout, that helplessness feeling that stays with us for a long time. So it's really important to our own resilience to define what we can alter and manipulate in order to have that influence on kids. And if we keep our focus there, these are my things that I can control to change what's going on around this kiddo, that's a more resilient place for me to be as an educator. And the easiest place to begin for our own sanity and the amount of energy that we have is asking, what can I change about my whole group instruction to make it more likely kids are going to show up and participate? And we highlighted our 3-part formula for ways to think about this. So help the kids belong. What can I do to make my classroom a safe, predictable, supportive place where the kids feel known and respected? Number 2, help them care about the content. So their voice and choice, and tying that content to their goals and their preferences and their interests. And part 3, help them feel successful. So that growth mindset, helping kids feel like, I'm going to show up and I will feel like I'm doing a good job.
Well, that's a wrap. So thank you for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you back when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Oh, and before we go, I just wanted to acknowledge again, thanks, Rye, for toughing it out without our third friend. I'm so proud of you. And guys, if you're listening, like Rye, remember to grow through what you go through. Bye.